Hey guys, another video. I wanted to talk about my favorite video game podcasts. This is something a lot of people do. A lot of people listen to video game podcasts. It's something I enjoy doing when I'm like grinding in an RPG or something like that, or I'm playing a game that's not really story driven. I like to put on a podcast. It's hard to find the time to listen to a bunch of them, but I have some favorites that I thought it'd be fun to talk about and kind of recommend to you guys. I'll link them in the description box, but. Yeah, let's get started with two podcasts that I've actually been on myself with some fellow YouTubers. The first one is Another Gaming Podcast, hosted by Dustin Christ, Stephen the Leggy Gamer, and Chance Doomwaves. And they put out a podcast maybe once every few months, whenever they find the time, basically. But yeah, I've been on it a few times. It's always been a lot of fun. So I would definitely highly recommend that. It's what they've basically talk about what they've been playing. Usually they'll have a main topic for each episode. They've had a lot of guests on in the past. Yeah, highly recommended. Of course, I'm showing a little bias here because I've been on these two podcasts I'm going to talk about. And then the other one is the Funny Nerd podcast, Leo's podcast that he does fairly regularly. I've been on that a few times. That's always a lot of fun. He talks about a lot of different topics. It's basically each podcast is its own different topic. I was recently on one talking about Bloodborne, and that was really fun. He has multiple guests on as well. So yeah, those are the two podcasts in kind of like the YouTube gaming community that I've been on and I really enjoy listening to. And then the rest of them are ones that are basically I just guess random podcasts that I like to listen to. The first one is called Watch Out for Fireballs on duckfeed.tv, which is kind of a network that hosts a bunch of different podcasts. And this one, Watch Out for Fireballs, is basically a podcast where these two guys will talk about a game in depth from start to finish. What they enjoyed, what they didn't enjoy. Some of the podcasts are split up into multiple parts depending on how long the game is. Final Fantasy VII, for instance, they did one on that, and it was like 3 episodes. Sometimes it's only 1 episode if it's a shorter game. Recently, they did one on Mega Man Legends. I don't like to listen to it if they're talking about a game I haven't played because there's plenty of spoilers, but they really go in depth and they're very knowledgeable, and you learn a lot about the game that they're talking about, and it's always interesting to hear a lot of the arguments. For instance, they did one on 999, which is one of my favorite games ever, and one of them hated it while the other liked it. So it was very interesting to kind of hear their arguments as to why they enjoyed or didn't enjoy that particular game. So yeah, I would definitely highly recommend that one. It's very entertaining. It's it's very entertaining, but at the same time quite knowledgeable. And I really like the podcasts that kind of go in depth on games and just stick to gaming. I know the Giant Bombcast is one of those ones that a lot of people love, and the Giant Bomb website in particular. But I can't get into it because they hardly ever talk about video games. It's always like what they're eating or some bullshit like that. I don't like podcasts like that. I don't know. I just find them incredibly boring. I don't really listen to gaming podcasts for the personalities, I guess you would say, but. Yeah, Watch Out for Fireballs I would highly recommend. Another one in the same vein, although there's 2 podcasts I like to talk about here. RPGFan.com is one of my favorite RPG heavy websites, and they have 2 podcasts, well 3, but 2 I listen to. The first one is Retro Encounter, where it's similar to Watch Out for Fireballs, where they basically have multiple episodes and just talk about a game from start to finish, and they're all playing it at the same time, multiple hosts. And they're obviously RPG focused. They're always going to be RPGs. They've done one on Final Fantasy Tactics, which was really awesome. Of course, I listened to it after I'd played through the game. They're doing one on Pokemon right now, all the different types of Pokemon games. Days Ex Human Revolution, they did one, so they don't specifically do Japanese RPGs. And that one's a very kind of humorous podcast. I've laughed quite a few times at it, but again, it's very in-depth. And they really dive into a game's story and RPG mechanics and things like that. So, yeah, that's another highly entertaining one. Another RPG fan podcast I really like is Random Encounter, which is kind of their flagship podcast. It's kind of like your basic podcast where they talk about what they've been playing, news and RPGs. Sometimes they'll talk about games that aren't RPGs, but they mostly talk about RPGs. So yeah, that's another really good one as well. I don't like it as much as Retro Encounter, but it's definitely an enjoyable podcast. And another RPG focused one, my favorite RPG focused podcast, is Axe of the Blood God, which is on usgamer.net. And that's like, I don't really like sites like IGN and GameSpot and things like that. But usgamer.net is a similar site in the same kind of vein, but it's more focused on pretty interesting articles. And I really like the staff at USgamer. Like, their tastes are like all across the board, but I find I really like my tastes really match with a lot of the people there. But Axe of the Blood God is their kind of RPG podcast hosted by Kat Bailey, and she really knows her shit. Like, she knows a ton about RPGs, and each episode is pretty short. Like, they never really go past an hour long. So if you're the type of person that can't really listen to like 2 hour long podcasts, I think this is a good one. Especially if you love RPGs. Recently, they did do a longer episode talking about RPG stories, narrative in RPGs, and that was really fascinating. Again, it's a very knowledgeable podcast. She has a bunch of different hosts, guest hosts on there. Sometimes they talk about games they've been playing recently. It is mostly focused on like RPGs that have come out recently, but there have been episodes where they talk about older RPGs. But really, really great podcast. One of my favorites. Another good one is Radio Free Nintendo, and this one's on NintendoWorldReport.com. And you'd think with a Nintendo-centric website that the podcast would be like not critical about Nintendo whatsoever, that they'd be kind of fanboys in a way, but that's not the case at all. It's a very knowledgeable podcast. All the four guys on it can really speak quite eloquently on it. The host, James Jones, his sense of humor I just fucking love. I think he's hilarious, and they really delve deep into some different topics depending on like the listener mail they get, and then they also talked about games they've been playing recently. But it's refreshing to hear a Nintendo-centric podcast that talks about other games sometimes and doesn't just if they don't like something that Nintendo is doing, they'll tell you about it, which is I think that's kind of refreshing, honestly. And also, you'd think it being a Nintendo-centric website, it'd be like kid-friendly or something like that, but no, there's a lot of swearing on the podcast too. And these guys are guys that have like regular day jobs too, which I don't know. I kind of find that it's kind of more relatable in that way too. So yeah, I definitely highly recommend podcast. It's one that I wasn't expecting to like when I heard about it, but I gave it a chance and I was pleasantly surprised. I'm always excited when a new episode of that comes out. And then finally, my favorite podcast. This is like I just anytime a new episode for this podcast comes out, I'm just like, fuck yes, awesome. And this one I wish was more popular. It's been around a long time. It was originally on OneUp.com, and that after that site got kind of shuttered, it kind of disappeared for a bit, I think, and then a Patreon got started up for it, and it got kind of relaunched. Maybe it's more popular than I think it is, but I feel like it should get more attention because this is a brilliant podcast, and it's called Retronauts. And again, USGamer.net hosts this as well. The main hosts are Bob Mackey and Jeremy Parrish, which are both like I guess gaming journalists you'd call them, that I actually like. A lot of gaming journalists I think are a joke, really. But these guys I really like. They've been in the industry for quite a while, and they know their shit. And this is obviously a retro-focused podcast. A lot of very interesting topics. Recently they did one on HAL Laboratory, and they like to do these types of podcasts where they talk about a video game developer and their history from the very beginning, the games they've made, the key people at that studio, and kind of how it's gone on over the years. And they really do their research. And you can tell because it's very knowledgeable. I learn something every single time I listen to one of their podcasts. It's also very entertaining as well. I don't think it's really all that dry either. And there's been a lot of podcasts focused on RPGs because Jeremy Parrish and Bob Mackey are both huge RPG fans. So they did one on Matsuno, the director for Final Fantasy Tactics. So they've talked about his kind of history in games, all the games that he's directed, and a lot of like the drama that's gone on with some of his games. For instance, Final Fantasy XII, the development of Final Fantasy XII, which I found to be extremely fascinating. And this podcast in general is just... Every single episode is fascinating, even ones that have topics that I don't think would be that interesting. They did one on, like, I think, what was it? Disney games, I think, like Capcom Disney games, and it was awesome. Like it was really informative, and I learned all this stuff about these games that I never had known. So it's yeah, I've loved pretty much every episode. It's fantastic. Like I'm always excited when they do a new one. They've done one on systems as well. They talk about a system's life and all the games that have come out for it. They did a really fantastic DS retrospective. I cannot recommend this podcast enough. It is awesome, and it's not too long. It's about an hour and a half usually, and then they have like kind of micro episodes that are kind of focus on smaller topics, and those are only around 15 minutes. So again, another podcast I definitely recommend to people that are kind of interested in the industry in general, in the past specifically. They don't really go anything before like the DS or anything like that. Or they did one on Devil May Cry. They also do series of games too, like Metroid. They did recently Devil May Cry, which is not that retro, so they don't talk about the newest Devil May Cry, but they talk about all the others. And yeah, all the guest hosts that they have are really informative as well. But yeah, I like this podcast, highly recommend it. But yeah, those are all the ones I listen to. It's still quite a bit. Some people probably listen to more, but if you have any recommendations, definitely go for it. Shoot, but I could maybe listen to one more, but because like I don't have the time to listen to all these as it is right now. So, but if you know a podcast that you think I would really love, definitely highly recommend it. I'd like to hear what podcasts you guys listen to. What are some of your favorite gaming podcasts? And gaming podcasts are the ones I only exclusively listen to. I know there's some other good ones, like that Serial podcast apparently is like really good too, but I don't really have the time for anything other than gaming podcasts. But those are some of my favorites. Again, what do you guys listen to? What are some of your favorites? Definitely recommend some if you think there's some really amazing ones that I've missed out on. But that's it, guys. I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.